Sometimes the most powerful voices are the quietest ones. What if the one person you thought was beneath you was actually the one who would change everything? What if the person you believed to be nothing special turned out to be the key to your own growth? Let's take a moment to think about that. It's easy to judge others based on their appearance, their background, or the assumptions we make. But what if, just like a diamond hidden in the rough, there's more beneath the surface than we realize? In the case of 14-year-old Jalen Harris, the quiet kid who sat in the back of the classroom, no one had any idea of the storm brewing within him. At his school, his classmates treated him like he was invisible, his teachers overlooked him, and his potential was ignored, until that day in Mr. Bailey's 8th grade math class. That was the day everything changed. But you see, no one expected what was about to unfold. Jalen didn't just get a chance to prove himself that day, he was about to shock everyone, including his teacher. It all started on a seemingly normal Wednesday morning. Jalen had always been the quiet type, someone who kept to himself, stayed out of trouble, and focused on his studies. He lived with his mom, who worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet, and his younger sister Maya, who looked up to him. Jalen always felt a responsibility to set a good example for her. He kept his head down, did his homework, and tried to stay out of the spotlight. But what most people didn't know was that Jalen was a genius, a math genius. He taught himself complex math formulas when he was younger, and his love for numbers and equations became his escape. While the other kids played sports or hung out with friends, Jalen spent hours solving problems. It wasn't just something he was good at, it was something he loved. But he never talked about it. Why would he? No one cared. No one noticed. Jalen's classmates thought of him as just another shy, quiet kid, always picked last in gym class, always sitting by himself during lunch. But there was something about him that no one understood. And it wasn't until one fateful day in math class that things took a shocking turn. Mr. Bailey, their math teacher, was known for being tough. He was always strict, often sarcastic, and didn't tolerate slackers. Mr. Bailey had made it clear from the first day of school that he expected the best from every student. And if you didn't meet his expectations, he had no problem calling you out in front of the class. Jalen never minded. He knew he didn't need to impress Mr. Bailey. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But Mr. Bailey seemed to have a different idea about who was worth his attention. That day, Mr. Bailey decided to challenge the class with a particularly difficult math problem. The kind of problem that made most of the class groan. It was long, complex, and filled with concepts they hadn't fully grasped. Mr. Bailey, as usual, called on students one by one to take a crack at solving it on the whiteboard. One by one, students stumbled through the problem, struggling to even get started. The room was filled with nervous chatter, and Mr. Bailey's smirk only grew as he watched his students fail. It wasn't a rare sight. Most kids in his class weren't top of the line in math, and Mr. Bailey enjoyed watching them struggle. Then, his eyes landed on Jalen, who had been quietly staring at his notebook, scribbling something on the side. "Jalen," Mr. Bailey called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're the quiet one. Let's see what you can do. Come up here and solve it." The class went silent. The kids around Jalen snickered, whispering under their breath, "There's no way he'll figure it out." Jalen stood up slowly, not saying a word. He didn't mind the taunts, but he hated being the center of attention. He walked to the whiteboard, his stomach in knots, his heart racing. The only thing on his mind was getting it right. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him. His palms started to sweat. Mr. Bailey handed him the marker and said, "Go ahead, genius. Show us what you've got." Jalen took a deep breath and began working through the problem. He didn't look up at the students or at Mr. Bailey. His mind was racing, calculating each number, each variable, and each step. As he wrote down the answer, the class watched in stunned silence. But Mr. Bailey was watching too. His face twisted into an expression of disbelief as Jalen continued working through the problem with ease, as if it were second nature to him. What no one knew was that Jalen had been solving equations like this for years. For him, math was a language, and the numbers spoke to him in a way that no one could understand. And just like that, Jalen wrote the final step and circled the answer. The room was dead silent. "Is that it?" Jalen asked, turning around to face the class. "I'm done." Mr. Bailey's jaw dropped. For a moment he just stared at the problem on the board, then looked at Jalen in disbelief. His expression shifted from surprise to anger. It was clear that Mr. Bailey was embarrassed. He had underestimated the quiet, shy kid who never caused trouble. "You think you're some kind of genius, huh?" Mr. Bailey sneered. "You think you're better than the rest of these kids because you can solve a math problem? Well, let's see how you handle this." Jalen was stunned. He didn't know what to say, but before he could respond, Mr. Bailey grabbed his notebook and tossed it on the floor in front of the class. "Pick it up, genius," he taunted. Jalen froze. The class was still silent, and the tension in the air felt thick, like it could snap at any moment. The students' eyes flicked between Jalen and Mr. Bailey, some of them looking uncomfortable, while others watched with amusement. It was then that Jalen's mind flashed back to all the times he had been made to feel invisible, every time someone made fun of his quiet nature or underestimated him because of his skin color. But this time, something inside of him clicked. The question was, would Jalen back down? Or would he finally stand up for himself and show Mr. Bailey, and the entire class, that his worth wasn't determined by anyone's assumptions? With a deep breath, Jalen bent down, picked up his notebook and straightened up. He looked directly at Mr. Bailey, his voice steady but firm. "You don't get to treat me like this." The room went deathly silent again. The bell rang and Mr. Bailey's voice was lost in the chaos of students rushing out of the room. But for Jalen, something had changed. He was done being underestimated. What would happen next? Would Mr. Bailey face the consequences of his actions? Would Jalen find the strength to speak out? The battle had just begun, and it was only going to get bigger. The next day, Jalen walked into school with a heavy heart. The weight of what had happened in Mr. Bailey's class still hung over him like a dark cloud. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his locker, his mind replaying the scene over and over. "You don't get to treat me like this." Those words felt strong when he said them, but now, with the entire school buzzing with whispers about the incident, they felt like a distant echo. Jalen didn't know what to expect. He knew he had done the right thing by standing up for himself, but the tension in the air was palpable. As he walked through the hallways, Jalen caught snippets of conversations. "I can't believe Mr. Bailey actually did that to Jalen. Yeah, he really called him out in front of everyone. That was harsh. Did you see how Jalen stood up to him, though? He actually talked back. That was kind of cool." Jalen's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and nervousness. Some of the students seemed impressed, others just curious. But there was still a lingering doubt in the back of his mind. The whispers could go either way. People could admire him for speaking out, or they could turn on him for making a scene. But that didn't matter. Jalen was determined to keep his head held high no matter what. When he reached his first class, he saw that Mr. Bailey was already there, standing at the front of the room with his usual stern look. As Jalen walked in, Mr. Bailey's eyes met his for a split second, and the tension in the room instantly thickened. The students noticed too. They went quiet, waiting for something to happen. Jalen sat down at his desk, trying to ignore the weight of everyone's gaze. He focused on the task at hand, getting through the day. But as Mr. Bailey began to speak, his words took an unexpected turn. "I want to apologize to the class for yesterday," Mr. Bailey said, his voice unusually cold. "It seems I may have been too harsh on Jalen." He paused, scanning the room, and Jalen could tell there was more he wanted to say but was holding back. Jalen sat still, unsure how to react. It wasn't like Mr. Bailey to apologize, especially not after taunting him in front of everyone. Jalen wasn't sure if he should take this as a sign that Mr. Bailey had learned something from the confrontation or if it was just an attempt to save face. The bell rang, signaling the start of class. Jalen focused on the lesson, tuning out the whispers around him. His classmates were still curious, still unsure of what to make of him. But as the day went on, Jalen began to notice something strange. More and more students were coming up to him in the hallways, asking him about the math problem he solved the day before. "Hey Jalen," one of his classmates, Chris, said as he approached during lunch. "That was crazy what you did in Mr. Bailey's class yesterday. You really showed him up, huh?" Jalen smiled awkwardly. "I guess so. But I didn't do it to show him up." Chris nodded. "I get it. But honestly, man, that was the most impressive thing I've seen all year. I didn't even know you were good at math." Jalen's stomach tightened. He didn't like the attention, but part of him couldn't deny that it felt good to be noticed for something other than being the quiet kid. "I mean, you should see how fast you work through equations. You're like a math genius or something," Chris added. Jalen didn't know how to respond to that. Genius? It sounded strange to him. He'd always been humble about his abilities, and now, for the first time, people were starting to see him in a different light. Throughout the rest of the day, Jalen found himself surrounded by more and more curious classmates, all eager to learn about his math skills. But with each conversation, something was beginning to change inside him. For the first time in his life, Jalen started to realize that maybe, just maybe, he was more than just the quiet, overlooked kid. He was starting to believe in his own worth. But the attention didn't come without its complications. As Jalen walked to his last class of the day, He overheard a conversation between two students, Jasmine and Ava, who were talking about the incident in Mr. Bailey's class. "Did you hear what Mr. Bailey said to Jalen after the bell rang yesterday?" Ava asked. Jasmine nodded. "Yeah, I heard he actually apologized. I didn't think he had it in him. But I still don't know if Jalen should have stood up to him like that. I mean, it's Mr. Bailey, right? He's the teacher. It's not like Jalen can get away with being disrespectful." Jalen's heart sank. The whispers weren't all positive. Some students still thought he had crossed a line by standing up for himself, and that feeling of being judged, of being seen as disrespectful, hit him harder than he expected. As he entered the classroom, Jalen's eyes locked with Mr. Bailey's. The teacher was standing near the chalkboard, scribbling something down, but when he saw Jalen, his face seemed to tighten. The apology from earlier had done little to remove the tension. Jalen sat at his desk, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had crept up on him. He couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. And as the class progressed, that feeling only deepened. It was the last 10 minutes of class when everything changed. Mr. Bailey announced that there would be a pop quiz on the material they had been studying. Jalen's stomach churned. He hadn't studied for it, he didn't need to. But that didn't mean he was ready for the spotlight again. As the quiz began, Jalen's hand flew across the paper, solving equations with ease. He had been here before. He didn't need anyone's approval. But just as he was finishing the last question, Mr. Bailey's voice interrupted. "Jalen," Mr. Bailey called, his tone cold once again. "Come up here and explain your answers. Let's see if you really understand the material or if you're just guessing." Jalen's heart dropped. He had already solved the problems. Why was Mr. Bailey doing this? Was it punishment for what happened yesterday? Was it just another way to put him in his place? The room fell silent as Jalen slowly stood up, walking to the front of the class. As he reached the whiteboard, he could feel everyone's eyes on him again, waiting for him to either confirm their assumptions or prove them wrong. But something was different this time. Jalen wasn't afraid. He was done hiding. He had spent years living in the shadow of others' opinions, and now, it was his time to shine. But as he began to explain the first problem on the board, something unexpected happened. Mr. Bailey didn't seem impressed at all. In fact, he looked frustrated. Jalen finished the explanation, only to hear Mr. Bailey scoff, "That's not how I would have done it." The words hit like a slap. What was going on? The room was quiet again, but this time, Jalen could feel something shifting. Something more than just a teacher-student power struggle. Something personal. And just when Jalen thought he couldn't take any more of Mr. Bailey's comments, Mr. Bailey leaned in and whispered, "You might be good at math, but you'll never amount to anything here. Not in this school. Not with people like you." The world seemed to stop. Jalen's hands tightened into fists. He had heard enough. What would he do now? Would he keep his head down and let the injustice slide? Or would he stand up, once and for all, and show Mr. Bailey and the entire school who he really was? Jalen's mind raced as Mr. Bailey's words echoed in his ears. "You'll never amount to anything here. Not with people like you." It wasn't the first time Jalen had been told something like that. Growing up, he'd often heard similar remarks from people who didn't understand him. But hearing it from a teacher, the one person who was supposed to help him succeed, felt like a slap in the face. It felt like all the years of hard work, all the hours he spent quietly honing his math skills, had been reduced to nothing by a single harsh statement. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. But Jalen refused to give Mr. Bailey the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked at the teacher with steady eyes. "I don't know what your problem is, Mr. Bailey," Jalen said, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm not going to let you tell me who I am. I know who I am. And I know what I'm capable of." The words felt like a release. It wasn't just the teacher he was talking to, it was everyone who had ever doubted him. Everyone who had ever made him feel like he was less than. The class was silent, watching, waiting. Even Mr. Bailey looked taken aback, his eyes narrowing in confusion. He wasn't used to students talking back to him, especially not a student like Jalen. But Jalen didn't care. The more he thought about what Mr. Bailey had said, the angrier he became, not just at Mr. Bailey, but at the entire system that had allowed people like him to get away with treating others as less than human. Jalen wasn't going to be silent anymore. Not when he had the power to change things. "I'm not a problem," Jalen continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not some project you can give up on. I'm here to stay. And I'm going to show you and everyone else that I'm more than you think I am." For a moment, Mr. Bailey seemed to hesitate. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. But the silence in the room was deafening. Jalen knew that he had just crossed a line, and for the first time in his life he felt proud of it. Jalen stepped away from the whiteboard and returned to his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. He had said what he needed to say. He had stood up for himself. And even though he had no idea what would happen next, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. But that calm didn't last long. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class, but the weight of what had just happened hung in the air. As Jalen gathered his things and made his way out of the classroom, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. Some were whispering, some were smiling. But Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. And sure enough, as he walked down the hallway, he heard his name being called out from behind him. It was Chris, the same guy who had complimented him the day before. "Jalen, wait up," Chris called, jogging to catch up. Jalen slowed his pace, his mind still racing with thoughts of the confrontation in class. Chris caught up to him, breathless but smiling. "Dude, that was epic," Chris said, his eyes wide with excitement. "You really stood up to him. I mean, I thought you were just gonna back down, but you didn't. That was awesome." Jalen nodded, but a part of him still felt uneasy. "Thanks, but it wasn't about being awesome. It was about not letting him push me around anymore." Chris stopped walking, looking at Jalen seriously. "Look, man. I know it's not easy, but you've got something that most people don't. You've got this talent. And you've got the guts to stand up for yourself. I think you could really go places with that." Jalen was quiet for a moment, processing Chris' words. It wasn't that he hadn't heard compliments before, but this felt different. For once, someone wasn't just complimenting him for being the quiet, smart kid in the back of the room. Someone saw him. Really saw him. "I don't know if I can go anywhere with it, Chris," Jalen said quietly. "I've spent so many years hiding my talents because I was scared of what people would think. Scared of being judged." Chris placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "You don't need to hide anymore. You're too good for that." Jalen smiled weakly, but deep down he knew Chris was right. It was time to stop hiding. As they walked toward the cafeteria, Jalen's thoughts began to drift back to the math competition that was coming up in just a few weeks. He had always wanted to enter, but he'd never had the courage to actually sign up. The idea of competing against other kids who were much more social than he was, kids who seemed to have it all together, terrified him. But now, with Mr. Bailey's words still fresh in his mind, Jalen began to feel a flicker of something else. A spark. A determination. If he could stand up to Mr. Bailey, then maybe he could take on something bigger. Maybe he could finally prove to himself, and to everyone else, that he was more than just the quiet kid. He was capable of greatness. When lunch ended, Jalen walked to his next class, a little more confident than before. But as he entered the classroom, he was hit with a cold wave of reality. Mr. Bailey was standing by the door, his arms crossed, waiting for him. "Jalen," Mr. Bailey said, his voice low and almost threatening. "We need to talk." Jalen felt his stomach twist. What now? Had the teacher really not learned his lesson? Was Mr. Bailey going to make this harder for him? "Sure," Jalen said, keeping his tone calm. "What's up?" Mr. Bailey's eyes narrowed. "I don't take disrespect from students. And I don't tolerate anyone trying to undermine my authority in my classroom. You will apologize for what happened yesterday." Now, Jalen froze. He couldn't believe it. After everything he had said, after standing up for himself in front of the class, Mr. Bailey was still trying to control him. He was still trying to put him in his place. Jalen's hands clenched again. He had a choice to make. He could apologize like Mr. Bailey demanded, and let the teacher walk all over him. Or he could stand his ground and face whatever consequences came with it. He took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. "I'm not apologizing, Mr. Bailey," Jalen said, his voice steady but strong. "Not for standing up for myself. And not for being who I am." Mr. Bailey's face turned red with anger. For a moment, Jalen thought the teacher might explode. But instead, Mr. Bailey simply sneered. "You're making a mistake, Jalen," Mr. Bailey warned. "You'll regret this." Jalen stood his ground. This was his moment. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. As he walked to his seat, Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. What would Mr. Bailey do next? Would Jalen's defiance come with consequences? And would he be able to rise above whatever was thrown his way? The days that followed felt like a storm brewing in slow motion. Jalen had braced himself for the worst after his stand against Mr. Bailey, but nothing could have prepared him for how much the situation would escalate. He walked into school the next morning with a heavy heart. He felt the eyes of his classmates on him as he passed by, some with sympathetic glances, others with judgmental stares. But no one said anything directly. No one dared to ask him about the confrontation in Mr. Bailey's class. It was as if the entire school had fallen into a strange kind of silence, one that seemed to hang over him like a cloud. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when Jalen entered his first class of the day and saw that Mr. Bailey was already there, standing in the front of the room with his arms crossed. Jalen's stomach twisted. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but whatever it was, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Mr. Bailey looked up as Jalen walked in, and their eyes locked for a brief moment. It was enough to send a chill down Jalen's spine. Mr. Bailey didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply stared at him with a cold, calculating gaze, like he was waiting for something. Waiting for Jalen to break. As Jalen sat down at his desk, he could feel the tension in the air. The other students seemed to notice too, but no one spoke a word. The class went on like normal, but Jalen could tell that something had shifted. The power dynamic had changed. Mr. Bailey wasn't the same teacher he used to be. There was something darker in the way he looked at Jalen now. It wasn't long before Mr. Bailey called on him. "Jalen," Mr. Bailey said, his voice tight. "Come up to the front of the class. I want to see if you can solve this problem correctly." Jalen's heart raced. He knew the math problem was going to be difficult. Mr. Bailey had a knack for making them harder than they needed to be. But this wasn't just about solving an equation. This was about proving himself to the teacher who had just tried to break him. Jalen stood up slowly, trying to keep his composure. He wasn't going to let Mr. Bailey intimidate him again. Not this time. As he walked to the front of the room, he could feel every eye on him. The silence was deafening. Mr. Bailey handed him a marker and pointed to the board. "Go ahead," he said, his tone condescending. "Show us how brilliant you really are." Jalen didn't flinch. He took the marker and began working through the problem on the whiteboard, just like he always did. The numbers and equations flowed naturally from his mind, like a river of clarity in his mind. But he wasn't just solving a problem. He was proving to himself that he was more than what Mr. Bailey, or anyone, thought of him. As he reached the final step, Jalen paused, scanning the equation to make sure everything was correct. He could feel Mr. Bailey's eyes burning into the back of his head, waiting for him to make a mistake. But Jalen wasn't going to make a mistake. Not today. With a steady hand, he wrote the final answer on the board and turned to face the class. There was a long pause as everyone looked at the board, the answer staring them in the face. Jalen had nailed it. "Is that it?" Jalen asked, his voice steady. "Am I done now?" Mr. Bailey said nothing. He just stared at the board, his jaw clenched. For a moment, Jalen thought the teacher might finally admit that he was wrong. Finally acknowledge that Jalen wasn't the student he had assumed he was. But instead, Mr. Bailey's expression darkened, and he finally spoke. "You're lucky you got that right, Jalen," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But don't think this means you're untouchable. I still don't like you." The words hit Jalen harder than he expected. He had hoped, even for a moment, that this confrontation would lead to some kind of understanding between him and Mr. Bailey. But instead, it felt like the teacher was only digging his heels in deeper, determined to make Jalen feel like an outsider. Jalen's hands tightened into fists, but he held his ground. He wasn't going to let Mr. Bailey's words defeat him. Not this time. "I don't need your approval," Jalen said, his voice firm. "But I'm not going to let you treat me like I don't belong here. I know what I'm capable of, and no one, especially you, can take that away from me." Mr. Bailey's face turned red with anger, and for a split second, Jalen thought the teacher might lash out. But instead, Mr. Bailey turned on his heel and stormed out of the classroom without another word. The class was silent. The students exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Jalen stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just faced down one of the most difficult moments of his life, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. But then, something unexpected happened. Chris, the guy who had been so supportive of Jalen since the confrontation in Mr. Bailey's class, walked up to him. "Dude," Chris said, a grin spreading across his face. "That was amazing. You actually stood up to him?" Jalen smiled weakly. He didn't feel amazing. He felt drained. But Chris's words, his encouragement, were like a lifeline in that moment. "Thanks, man," Jalen said quietly. "But I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I don't know if I can keep fighting against this every day." Chris placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "You've got this, Jalen. You're stronger than you think. And I'm here for you. We're all here for you." Jalen's heart swelled. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this after all. But as the day went on, Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. Mr. Bailey had already shown how far he was willing to go to put Jalen in his place. But what if it got worse? What if Jalen's defiance led to something more dangerous? Jalen's thoughts were interrupted by a loud commotion coming from down the hall. He turned his head toward the noise, and his stomach dropped when he saw a group of students gathered around, whispering and pointing. Jalen's heart sank as he walked toward the crowd, his legs feeling like lead. When he reached the group, he saw what they were all staring at, a large poster hung up on the bulletin board. And written in bold, black letters were the words, "Jalen Harris, the teacher's problem child. Are we really going to let him get away with this?" The message was clear. Someone had gone out of their way to single Jalen out, again. But this time it wasn't just Mr. Bailey. The entire school seemed to be turning against him. Jalen stood frozen, staring at the poster, his mind racing. Was this the start of something bigger? Would he be able to rise above the hate and continue fighting? Or was this the breaking point? What would happen next? The poster on the bulletin board felt like a dagger to Jalen's heart. The words were bold and unmistakable, and they seemed to burn into his mind with every passing second. Jalen Harris, the teacher's problem child. Are we really going to let him get away with this? He couldn't believe it. Not just because someone had gone so far as to target him, but because of how much it felt like everything he had worked for, his sense of self-worth, his ability to stand up for himself, and his quiet confidence, was being torn down in an instant. As he stood there, frozen in front of the poster, he felt the eyes of the students around him. They were whispering, pointing, and some even seemed to be watching with amusement, as though they were enjoying the spectacle. Jalen had always been the quiet kid, the one who avoided attention, but now, it seemed like all the eyes in the school were on him. One of the students in the crowd, a girl named Tasha, walked over and tapped him on the shoulder. "Jalen, man, that's messed up," she said, her voice full of concern. "Who did this?" Jalen shook his head, his hands trembling. "I don't know, but I don't care," he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know why they're doing this. I don't know why they're making me the villain." Tasha nodded sympathetically. "You're not the villain, Jalen. Trust me. You're just the one who's willing to stand up to them." Those words, simple as they were, felt like a weight had been lifted from Jalen's chest. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone to tell him that. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that he wasn't alone in this. But even as Tasha's words helped, Jalen couldn't ignore the fact that the situation was escalating. This wasn't just a teacher-student issue anymore. It was becoming a school-wide issue. And no matter how strong Jalen was, no matter how much he believed in himself, he couldn't help but feel the pressure building around him. By the time lunch rolled around, Jalen knew he had to do something. He couldn't just let this continue. He couldn't let the whispers and the taunts tear him apart. But he also knew that confronting the entire school, or even just Mr. Bailey, wouldn't be easy. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the backlash, or what would happen if he did. Still, there was a fire inside him that refused to be extinguished. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to let anyone, not even the entire school, make him feel small anymore. He was done being underestimated. After lunch, Jalen decided to take a stand. He went straight to the school office and asked to speak to the principal, Mrs. Grant. He had no idea what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't just ignore the poster. He couldn't let the entire school think that what had happened in Mr. Bailey's class was okay. And he couldn't let them think he was going to back down. Mrs. Grant was in her office when Jalen walked in. She was sitting at her desk, typing something on her computer, but when she looked up and saw Jalen standing in front of her, she immediately noticed the seriousness in his expression. "Jalen," she said, her tone warm but concerned. "What's going on? You seem upset." Jalen took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you about something," he began, his voice steady. "It's about the poster. The one that's up on the bulletin board." Mrs. Grant frowned, clearly taken aback. "What poster are you talking about?" Jalen turned and pointed to the door, where the poster had been hung up for all to see. Mrs. Grant followed his gaze and instantly understood. Her expression turned to one of concern. "Jalen, I didn't know about this," she said softly. "I'm so sorry this is happening." Jalen nodded, but the anger and frustration were still boiling inside him. "I don't want to be treated like this. I didn't do anything wrong. All I did was stand up for myself. I solved a math problem in class. Why is that a problem?" Mrs. Grant leaned forward, her face filled with empathy. "I understand, Jalen. And I'm so sorry that you're feeling this way. It's unacceptable for anyone to be treated like this, especially by their classmates. But I want you to know that I'm here to help. We're going to get this sorted out, okay?" Jalen felt a flicker of hope. Mrs. Grant wasn't brushing him off. She wasn't making excuses. She was actually listening to him. "I'm just tired of being looked down on," Jalen continued, his voice cracking slightly. I'm tired of people thinking they can tell me who I am. I'm not a problem. I'm not what they think I am. And I'm not going to apologize for who I am anymore. Tears welled up in Jalen's eyes, but he wiped them away quickly. He didn't want to show weakness, not now. Not when he was finally standing up for himself. Mrs. Grant gave him a sympathetic smile. You don't need to apologize for being yourself, Jalen. No one should make you feel that way. We're going to handle this. We'll find out who posted that and make sure it's addressed. And I'll personally talk to Mr. Bailey too. This isn't over. Jalen felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in days he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had someone in his corner. As he walked out of the office, Jalen took a deep breath, feeling a sense of determination welling up inside him. He didn't know how long it would take to fix everything or if it would all ever go away. But one thing was certain. He was going to keep fighting. He was going to keep standing up for himself, and he was going to keep proving that he was worth more than anyone had ever given him credit for. The next morning, when Jalen walked into school, he noticed something was different. The poster had been taken down. The whispers in the hallways had stopped. And for the first time in weeks he felt like he could breathe. Mr. Bailey didn't say anything to him that day. There were no sarcastic remarks, no cruel comments. It was as if the teacher had finally realized that Jalen wasn't going to be his punching bag anymore. As Jalen walked through the halls, he noticed the other students were treating him differently. Some were still hesitant, unsure of what to think of him, but there were others who looked at him with newfound respect. Even Chris gave him a thumbs up as they passed in the hallway. Jalen had done it. He had faced his fears, stood up for himself, and refused to let anyone dictate his worth. And while he knew the battle wasn't over, he also knew that this was only the beginning. He wasn't just going to survive this school year, he was going to thrive. And no one, not even Mr. Bailey, was going to take that away from him. Jalen had learned that no matter how hard the fight, no matter how many obstacles lay ahead, his worth could never be taken away. He had the power to define himself, to rise above the hate, and to be the person he knew he was meant to be. Because no matter what anyone said, he was more than enough.